Welcome, and thanks for joining Land Connection 2021. My name is Sara Thiam. I'm the Chief Executive of SCDI, and I'm your chair this afternoon. We have Sarah Smith from the Land Commission in the background helping out with any technical queries, and please be aware that this event's being recorded, including the chat and the comments section. The video recording may be published on our YouTube channel, so please have a read of the details on this slide for more information. So in terms of format for this afternoon, David Stewart from the Land Commission is going to take us through the Land for Housing report. Then we're going to hear from 5 experts. They'll bring their unique perspective to the question we're trying to answer this afternoon. They'll talk about how the way we're delivering housing can help drive a green and fair recovery. So I've got 5 panelists, including David, Peter Marshall from Perth and Kinross, Perth and Kinross even. I haven't got my teeth in. Barbara Cummins from RTPI, Michaela Sullivan from East Lothian Council, and John Lowe from Robertson Residential Group. I'll chair a discussion with the panel before coming to you for questions and answers. We're keen to hear your views, ideas, and any relevant work you and your organisations are doing. So please post your questions on the chat or indeed raise your hand once we get to the Q&A section. So I'm just going to introduce each of the panelists in turn just before they speak. But first up, we have David Stewart, who's the Policy and Practice Lead for the Scottish Land Commission. His remit includes work on land assembly, placemaking, land value capture, and affordable rural housing. David joined from the SFHA, where he led on new build affordable housing, planning reform, energy efficiency, and regeneration. David, over to you.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and I'll just share my screen if that's okay. And if the screen sharing could be enabled, that would be great. Great, thank you. Yeah, I'm just going to give quite a short presentation, but I thought it'd be helpful as context for the discussion if I just have a quick run through of the review of land for housing, which we've undertaken over the last 2 years or so. I've given that the title of Delivering More Homes in Better Places, which was actually the name of one of the reports that helped to make up the review. And I've used that as I think it really encapsulates very neatly what we're looking to achieve with our proposals for land market reform. So what I plan to cover today is, firstly, why does land for housing matter? Why is it important? A brief overview of the content of the review, and then I'll talk about the main findings before going on to cover what we think should be the key principles for reform of the housing land market. And I'll close by outlining the 5 specific recommendations within the review. So the reasons that land for housing matters, well, a couple of obvious ones that I think people will all be aware of, a lot of discussion of whether there's a housing crisis. So there's the issue about us not really delivering enough homes to meet need and demand in spite of significant government investment. And there's also concerns about the affordability of housing and also choice, particularly for younger people and for older people. But beyond that, housing has an impact on other important policy issues, such as the economy, and both in terms of affordability and labour market mobility, but also the way we deliver homes and the sort of places we create have an impact on our ability to mitigate climate change, to promote active travel. Housing is crucial to fulfilling rural repopulation. And also, I think we all became very conscious over the last couple of years or so with COVID, that the places that we live and the spaces around us are so important to our health and well-being. This is just a short overview of the work that made up the review. I'm not going to read through it all. You can see it for yourself, but it's just to show there was quite a wide range of work. And particularly important throughout was that we had in-depth stakeholder engagement on issues and on each of our reports and findings. Now, this next slide, I think, is really quite important in terms of the review, and what we found. It comes from a piece of work that Savills undertook for us on land for rural housing. And really what it shows is the way the housing land market operates in Scotland and some of the consequences of that. So if you look at the panel on the top left, this is shows an urban housing market in a growth area, or perhaps close to a city. And within that sort of market, there's enough land value and there's enough profit that can be made for large house builders to develop, make enough profit to cover both the risk they take in developing land and also provide a shareholder return. But if we move to the top right panel, the town market, and the profit's lower, it's not really enough for the speculative house building model. And so you're relying on SMEs for private housing. And we found that since the 2008 crash, really that sector is significantly diminished. If we move on then to look at the bottom two quadrants, remote villages and rural places, essentially what it shows is there isn't the value there for private house building to operate. And equally, actually, that could apply to regeneration areas in a lot of post-industrial Scotland and to town centres. So what I'm really trying to show here is that with our mainly market-led housing, which has really been the model that delivers most of Scotland's housing over the last 30 or 40 years, you're only really getting development in a few areas. In other areas, there's market failure. And that means if you want to deliver housing, then others have to step up, such as local authorities, housing associations, or communities themselves. So to try and summarise a couple of years' work in a few bullet points, the main findings from the review were, firstly, that private house building focuses on greenfield sites and high value areas. That's not a criticism. Their duties to manage risk and to provide shareholder return. So following on from that, if we want to increase house building in other areas, such as regeneration areas, town centres in rural Scotland, and deliver some of the outcomes I mentioned at the start, then there needs to be support in terms of skills and resources to achieve this. There's also a need to move over time from a short-term profit approach to one that's more about patient capital, placemaking, and the public interest. We found that collaborating with communities actually leads to positive outcomes in terms of better places, but also crucially support for development. And finally, we found that the best outcomes can occur where the public sector plays a leading role in land promotion and shaping markets. And we find this tends to be the exception in Scotland. In some of our European neighbours, such as the Netherlands and Germany, it's really pretty standard. So this slide, just briefly from the RTPI publication, Planning the Scotland We Need. Really on the left-hand side, it shows where we are at the moment in terms of development and place. And on the right-hand side, it's where we need to get to deliver better places and to deliver housing in the public interest. So just concluding, in the last couple of slides, we've outlined there what we think should be the principles for housing land market reform. So we think the public sector should play a more proactive role in land promotion, sharing both the risks but also the rewards. There needs to be support for development in places where the spec house building model doesn't operate. But that's not to suggest a public sector takeover. We're talking about a collaborative partnership. The public sector plays its role, but developers are still partners and they're the main developers of new housing. And finally, we think there should be clarity in the housing land market and where new development may occur. So I'm just going to briefly outline the 5 recommendations from the review. And it's important to say these should be put in place in a phased approach in order to have a gradual move from the current very much market-led system to one that's more about public interest. So the first is to create a network of place pioneers that allows development of land in areas that usually wouldn't occur, focusing on public sector land that's underused and on rural estates that need investment. The second is to enable local authorities to establish regeneration partnership zones. That would have powers to help them deliver development of challenging sites and fragmented ownership, powers such as compulsory purchase and also the right to preemption. We also think there needs to be clarity on how best to capture publicly created uplifts in land values, and we proposed a number of options by which this could be delivered. We think the Scottish Land Agency should be established to supply the skills to actually enable this shift to a public interest approach. And finally, as I already mentioned, we think there should be transparency on where developments can take place so that communities can have a major role in actually determining where the best place for housing would be. Thank you. I'll pass back over to our chair, Sara, now.
Thanks very much, David. Next up, we've got Barbara Cummins. Barbara is the chair of RTPI. She's the current convener of the Royal Town Planning Institute in Scotland. Until April this year, she was Director of Heritage at Historic Environment Scotland, where she led the functions responsible for planning, advice and consents, designations, World Heritage, and the HES archives. Barbara, over to you.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, David, for setting the context for that. Scottish Land Commission recommends that the public sector needs to play a more active role in delivering land for housing and points out there's no single silver bullet. For me, that means prioritising and resourcing the entire system better, and I need to stop tinkering with pointless side issues. We have a housing crisis and a climate emergency. That ought to drive everything. I'm afraid I'm going to start with politicians. The passage of the Planning Scotland Act in 2019 saw it become the most amended bill in Holyrood history. That's not a positive accolade. That's down to playing politics, if you ask me. And that's my view, not that of the RTPI. It also resulted in 91 unfunded duties, which the RTPI estimate could cost between 12 and 59 million over 10 years to implement. While the RTPI has called for the resources to deliver on these duties, my personal view is we ought to be looking at the duties first and asking if they actually meet the priorities that Scotland now faces. We need to make sure that when NPF 4 and Scottish planning policy come before the Scottish Parliament, that we don't end up in the same nonsensical situation. That means collaboration between all of us, and that's a key theme that's run through the SLC report. There is more that unites us than divides us. Valuing the role of planning has to be more than blah, 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 to quote a recent commentator. If we want to get an entire system that supports growth, we need regulations and national policies that remain fit for purpose and respond to a rapidly changing environment. That means resourcing in government focused on delivery too. Our new chief planner needs a team around her and the backing of all of government. As well as land for housing, we need to look at opportunities more widely, and I would include our town centres in that. That means policies and regulations that keep up with what's happening in the real world, not decades behind, and that needs dedicated resource. When it comes to local authorities, RTPI research has shown that planning services are one of the most severely affected of all local government services in terms of budgets, with a reduction of 42% and nearly a third of planning department staff cut since 2009. That's enormous. That's compounded with the fact that we've estimated that over the next 10 to 15 years, there'll be a demand for an additional 680 to 730 entrants into the planning sector. I'd also suggest that constant pleas to look at planning fees misses the point. Yes, fees ought to be ring-fenced so someone applying for permission knows that their fee is actually going on the service they are paying for. Where else in life is that not the case? But it also creates a perverse incentive for some. Focusing on income doesn't focus on priorities or outcomes. So to support a green recovery and the recommendations of the Scottish Land Commission report, there's a need to reinvest in all public planning services and invest in initiatives such as planning apprenticeships to improve the supply of planners in the face of increased demand for their services. We won't get better plan making, community engagement, collaborative working and outcomes without the people to do that. Thank you.
Barbara, thank you very much indeed. Next up, we have Peter Marshall. Peter is Planning and Housing Strategy Manager in Perth Kinross Council and has worked in planning and local government for 43 years. My goodness, you need to be decorated for services to the nation, Peter. He currently manages 4 teams delivering the council's development plan, local housing strategy and affordable housing build programme, transport planning function, and the council's sustainable development climate change response. So just a quiet job then, Peter, eh?
Thank you. It may be 43 years, but it won't be much longer. First of all, I welcome the work of the Scottish Land Commission raising the profile of this debate, and I hope this time round it prompts some action. So my perspective of some of the issues. Ensuring an adequate land supply is both an economic and social necessity, and in my view, the current system's not delivering. For decades, we've seen too much focus on housing land, and if we're serious about delivering sustainable places for the people of Scotland to live, work and play, we need to be delivering mixed-use developments and not just housing land. And let's face it, in rural Scotland, much of the employment land doesn't deliver an economic return. Never mind the slides we've just seen showing about housing land and profit margins. There's a combined series of problems in my view. Multiple ownership of land leads to difficulties in assembling sensible sites. We have unrealistic and aspirational land values. This results in quality being driven by the economic considerations and not the needs of our community or environment. And the tools we have are not delivering for us. CPOs are slow, and the risks associated with the ultimate land value of a compensation claim means that these are not often used as they present too much risk to a local authority. And I'll like the earlier slide from the Land Commission that talked about sharing risk, and that needs to be the key, not just a one-way process there. But what are we going to do about it? Well, where the private sector is not delivering, I fully agree the public sector needs to take a much more active role in land assembly and delivery. The key infrastructure needs to be planned and delivered where appropriate upfront, and in most cases for strategic infrastructure, this can only be led by the public sector in my view. To make this transformational change, we need the tools. I've already highlighted the problems with needing simplified compulsory acquisition procedures or some other mechanism. And we need to know up front when we are going into these procedures what the land value will be and the fact that it can deliver an economic return to the local authority to cover the outlay. You think about it, would any sane developer enter into a land deal not knowing what the ultimate land value was? I think the shareholders would be pretty annoyed at that. Through ownership and a realistic land value comes an enhanced ability to enforce higher quality and deliver the type of housing, the tenures required by our communities. Now, where the public sector has invested in infrastructure up front, and we don't control the site, we need a more robust system to ensure that the returns can come back to the local authority on a shared basis in terms of risk. What is not good in the system is that it is open to appeal, and open to appeal after the investment has been made. Again, this introduced a risk element, which certainly the finance teams and the members are reluctant to accept. We also need an ability where sites are stalled or slow to release to be able to intervene, potentially allowing developers who can deliver an accelerated programme to access the site. So that's just some initial thoughts. But really, I have to outline my key concern is, it seems simple, let's review the system, but I'm old enough to remember numerous attempts at UK and Scottish level to address the land issues. None of these have delivered. And the key question for our politicians this time round is, are they brave enough for the transformational change that's required? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. We're really getting a sense, I think, of the complexities involved in all of this, so thanks for that. Next up, Michaela Sullivan. Michaela is Head of Service for Development at East Lothian Council and also has executive experience in the house building industry, where she led the land and planning functions UK-wide at Cala Group. Previously, Michaela was Assistant Chief Planner for Scotland with responsibility for policy in the 2006 Planning Act, Green Belts and e-planning. Michaela, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction. And can I say that I welcome the review and the thoughts behind the recommendations. And I think that they bring into focus the challenges we face and the conflicts and complexities that exist in the delivery of homes for all people that need them. When I look at things like this, it always takes me back to Geddes, who's the kind of father of planning. And Geddes' view was that there were essential interlinkages between the three sort of strands or pillars of place, work, and folk. And that actually reflects some of the things that Peter's just said and some of the findings of the review and so on. Place, work, and folk all together. And we do tend to just concentrate on one or another or you know, highlight certain parts of the planning system rather than actually thinking about what would create a successful environment and the homes that people need and so on. So to highlight some of these conflicts and perhaps draw some of the threads that I think arise from the findings of the review, as planners, I think we want simultaneously to pursue a place-based model for development. I don't think anybody argues against that. But the language that's often used is around minimising the amount of land needed for development, promoting density policies, sometimes up to 40 dwellings per hectare, and then recognising at the same time, even whilst we pursue such policies, that people aspire to homes with gardens front and back. And you get into questions then about how much land you actually need. Maybe we need more land, but you know, the language we're using is that we need to minimise the amount of land that we need for development. One of the recommendations is around using public land to deliver more affordable homes. This may be a positive step. But for example, if the site that the public sector owns is a school that's being sold to fund the new one, you just create a hole in another balance sheet somewhere else. You might also, for example, have a listed building on that site, and rent and affordable sale prices possibly couldn't cover the cost of the refurbishment. So again, who subsidises that gap? It may be seen to be a good idea, but in actually delivering it in reality, it could be difficult. Reflecting on land value capture and bearing in mind that landowners also have to pay capital gains tax, which actually gets sometimes forgotten in this debate. I absolutely think that land value capture is something that we need to make work, and perhaps better than the way we do with Section 75 at the moment, although of course Section 75 captures land value. and that both the capital gains tax, if that's the route that we want to pursue, and the land value capture should be used to fund infrastructure, because infrastructure is what is needed to create successful places. It's not just about the houses, it's not just about the workplaces, it's about all the things that make a successful area. So to create these successful places, we do need to find a way to make this work. And land value capture is probably not the whole answer. I don't think in quite a lot of examples there is sufficient land value available to develop all the infrastructure that's needed. So public funds are also needed for infrastructure. And this is something that we haven't actually addressed for quite a long time, because we often sit back and just expect it to come from Section 75 or whatever. I'm interested in the idea of a public land agency. This might help with regeneration particularly, and also connections into the existing fabric. And I've seen German models of public land assembly, and some of that's been discussed and amongst the case studies in the review. In complex urban areas, I can see a role for this. But when you look at the regeneration of complex urban areas, you also have to think about the soul of a place and the fact that you actually need low value uses, low value land uses, in order to have an overall successful place. And if you regenerate our sort of complex urban grain, those gritty areas where small businesses and low value land uses thrive, you actually take some of the heart out of the urban area. And you've seen these debates unfold. There was a debate in Edinburgh around a site, which I think even led to one of the 91 amendments to the planning bill that Barbara mentioned earlier. So, there's some very difficult stuff here. It's not simple. And for any of this to work, there's always the fact that there is so much conflict around housing. Some of it's politically driven, and that's very difficult. There's also public sentiment against new housing. And, you only have to look at a mention of a new housing development in, the Edinburgh Evening News, for example. Go to the comments section. I can never help myself. I know I shouldn't, but I go to the comments section. And the things that you see mentioned most often are phrases like brown envelopes and little boxes. So we need to actually shift the whole sort of paradigm away from this negative attitude towards new housing, except we need more homes, and that we need to consider the term community in its widest sense. And when I say that, I think we need to reduce objection opportunities, because who we consider to be the community might be the sofa surfing single mom in need of a new home, or it might be the middle class person in their 4-bedroom house with garden front and back sitting saying, I don't want another house built near me. And we often actually listen to the latter, but we don't go looking for and listen to the former. So we need to consider overall, who is the community? So unless we embrace housing politically and as a society and reduce these policy contradictions, we're still going to have a problem, no matter how many reviews we have of land, of planning, and so on and so forth. So I want to highlight or go back to the linkages that Geddes set out for us: place, work, and folk. And I actually think that we should channel the spirit behind a sign that appeared in the window of a pub near me recently, which said, new owner, new staff, new menu, new attitude. I think we probably need all those things. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Michaela. And you really must give up looking at the comments section in the Evening News. It's not good for you. And finally, we are moving to, sorry, I am just double checking that yes, I'm on, sorry. We're moving to John from Robertson Residential Group. He's a former chairman of Homes for Scotland. John is its current vice chairman, and his passion for customer satisfaction and quality also sees him sit on NHBC Council as an industry representative. For 15 years, from 2004 to 2019, he was managing director for one of Scotland's leading private house builders, where he contributed to the geographic expansion of housing activities out with the business's traditional operational area. John, over to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Before I do start, I would just highlight that today's commentary, I have my own personal views and not that of my business. And I'll just touch on some key areas that I wish to pick up today, and that's about rural housing, town centres, and a little bit on the green recovery. Starting with the rural housing, having over the years looked at potential rural housing, the likes of Moray, Aberdeenshire, Angus, Perthshire and the likes, it strikes me that the role of housing can play a sustained economic activity, and it's been a missed opportunity. For a number of years, we've had a plan-led system. However, we seem to struggle to maintain an effective minimum 5-year land supply on a national picture. And just to remind everyone, this is different from having an established supply. And I've been involved in many land audits over the years. In my opinion, the report touched on a number of key aspects. However, personally, I don't see that CPO will not be the route to secure delivery of a house, regardless of the tenure. Again, in a rural context, it should also be reminded that a large portion of rural Scotland earn a living from the land itself. An LDP can allocate land, however, it's only a portion of the process for delivery of housing. The effectiveness of land and the ability to deliver is critical, even if land is controlled and available for housing accommodated, whether CPO'd or not. Personally, I have found that the largest barrier to rural delivery has been the lack of capacity of infrastructure, drainage and other utility capacities. Of course, land values in rural Scotland are less pressurised than more urban areas. Therefore, in my opinion, at a national level, isn't the barrier that it's set out to be in terms of delivering for new housing. The economic balance of viability for private builders is a key issue, as most of these will fall into the SME category, who do face stiff headwinds in securing funding for development, whether that be buying the land itself or indeed the construction financing requirements. It's become very, very tough since 2008 for the SME sector of house building to actually deliver. And against a backdrop of which is a typically slower build-out rate, and it makes the proportion of finances costs even higher for these smaller developers. I consider that the issue of negative land values is also an issue which is not taken into consideration in a rural housing delivery context. Economically, there are national policies which impact each other. For example, tourism is rightly seen as a growth area. However, we see competition for existing housing stock for either holiday lets or second-hand homes, which often pushes up the existing market level for house values and pushes these out with the grasp of locals, which in turn prevents them from buying on the housing ladder. Consequently, this pushes more pressure for land release for new housing and puts more pressure on the public purse for affordable housing requirements in terms of HAG or other infrastructure provision. Of course, there's also less available for Section 75 contributions to make up the shortfall in, shall I call it, public infrastructure. In terms of town centres, it is an interesting challenge, and I don't suggest in any shape or form that I have all the answers. But having looked at a number of these type of initiatives over the years, I've struggled to make the viability of these stack up, given what has tended to be the main issue of brownfield development, risk of unknowns, in most cases, the redevelopment taking the form of refurbishment of existing buildings, many of which can carry listed building consent, and others which do not and are therefore subject to VAT, all of which puts a real burden on viability of development. Of course, we also now see well-published conflicts with the nighttime economy versus residential use in town and city centres, where often competing interests fail to find the appropriate balance for both established land, property uses, development proposals, and the wider community. Multi-ownership does present a real challenge here with competing interests. Interestingly, the Land Commission report considers existing use values. However, these can often vary significantly depending on existing consented use or via certified or alternative use. These can lead to existing land values being ahead of what would be considered residential land when utilising the residual valuation method. I consider that the issue of negative land values is also an issue which is not taken into consideration, particularly when preferred residential use would be affordable housing. Of course, there are examples of a different approach by local authorities already, which see an example of the likes of plan and gain to stimulate investment, ensure viability, overcome multi-ownership issues. And we see that with the waiving of Section 5 or other types of contributions to help stimulate the redevelopment of some town centres. In terms of green sector, I just want to clear the sector is indeed on board for the necessary role it has to play in reducing carbon emissions. The real difficulty isn't the acceptance by the sector, but the ability for a truly joined up approach through the transition phase. And I emphasise the transition phase. Case in point, I would contend, is the lack of a national energy strategy, which covers energy generation through to transmission in the grid and local networks mapped against the timeframe set. Timelines for transition, in my opinion, will see the grid and local networks being unable to cope with the demand side for electricity when the likes of all properties requiring electric vehicle charging, pump solutions, or other types of non-fossil fuel dependent energy transmission and generation at peak times. This is the case for new build, and all of which will be added to in terms of retrofit of existing stock. The government targets for net zero are not the question, nor is the sector's willingness to do so for new build. I just wonder how joined up the what, the how, and the when really are. Thank you.
John, thank you so much. And some real common threads emerging there through all of the presentations. There's some great questions beginning to appear in the chat, so that's great. Keep those coming in the chat. But to start with, I'm going to abuse my position as chair and pick up very briefly on something that both John and Michaela touched on actually, which was around infrastructure. Now, one of the hats that I have worn in the past is on the Infrastructure Commission, and we shared your view that place needs to be at the heart of a coherent infrastructure prioritisation. And to enable that, one of the things we called for was the Scottish Government to lead the development of a place-based assessment of long-term housing supply and demand, supported by a coherent strategy for the labour market and business opportunities arising from an inclusive net zero economy. So in other words, we saw the need for a housing needs assessment based on real needs, including national demographics, where new greenfield and best use of existing brownfield sites could happen, thinking about 20-minute neighbourhoods. You know, we were thinking about the underlying infrastructure that would support people to live in rural areas, like broadband, sustainable transport. John's picked up on energy there as well. But I suppose the real question is, you know, where should we be prioritising the development? Should we be prioritising development in existing towns? You know, should we be trying to accommodate or to prevent housing? Do we want focused growth around core areas in a few places, or do we want growth everywhere? So I'm going to come perhaps, maybe I think perhaps to Michaela and John first to pick on the infrastructure points, but to the other panelists around that, to what extent has that ask around doing a needs assessment of housing and really tough decisions about, well, where do we need to prioritise and what's our strategy here? So if I could come to you first, perhaps, Michaela.
Questions around infrastructure are really difficult because infrastructure is hugely costly, and traditionally infrastructure is something that's been provided by the public sector. And so we've come to a point where, you know, somewhere along the line, because of constraints in public spending and so on, you know, we started to push responsibility for infrastructure onto the development industry. So as development was brought forward, you know, infrastructure requirements had to be met too. And the kind of basis of that started with something that was, I mean, you know, I think the terminology was directly and proportionately related or something like that. And the original requests were for, you know, capacity at this junction is going to be affected by more people turning into the development. So, you know, the development should pay for the traffic lights. And that actually made perfect sense. But where we've got to now is that you know, we've got this kind of broader issue around how we fund infrastructure. And there is undeniably, and it's come out of the research here, a significant uplift in land value that takes place when, you know, planning permission is granted and land is developed. So there is something about how you draw some of that income that otherwise basically just goes to the landowner. It doesn't go to the developer either, and there's a misconception about where it actually ends up. That, you know, there should be a mechanism for taking some of that value and using it to fund infrastructure. But that in itself isn't going to be sufficient. You know, if you've got a housing development, you know, a fairly large housing development, perhaps with some employment land and so on and so forth as part of that development, you might trigger the point where you need, you know, the sort of really significant infrastructure like secondary schools and so on. And yet, you know, it's not going to work if we just suggest that the development would be able to fund something of that order and magnitude. Similarly, things like, you know, sort of bypass roads and, you know, new rail halts and, you know, tram infrastructure in Edinburgh. There are a whole load of kind of, you know, major infrastructure interventions which can't be funded entirely off land uplift. And, you know, I think quite a lot of, when you actually look at public objection, obviously I talked about public objection, and I do quite passionately believe that we need to reduce the amount of confrontation that we have in the planning system and actually giving people an opportunity to complain about every proposed new development. It would be far better if you actually try and engage people, properly engage people in development planning, so that the community has a stake in the plan, and then let the planning system, you know, take effect, if you know what I mean. However, you know, if we're going to just sit back and say, well, land value is going to fund these really big items of infrastructure, we're going to continue to have a problem. But most communities, when they object, aren't really objecting to development at all. If you actually look at the comments that they make, whether on the evening news comments section that I shouldn't look at or not, what people are saying is, I already can't get an appointment at the doctor's, you know, I'm worried the school will have too many children, so there's no room for my child. All those sorts of things. So some of the conflict that we've generated is because we've actually neglected infrastructure and left it to be provided by some unknown and mythical means. So, you know, as part of a reset, if we are going to reset, we actually need to be honest about the funding of infrastructure and how much of it can come from land value and how much of it actually just needs traditional public sector investment.
Yeah, and actually the other thing that we'd called for was an infrastructure first approach, which you know, wasn't our idea. I have to say, it had already been spoken about and was being talked about. John, do you want to come in briefly, or other members of the panel? I don't know if Barbara or David or Peter want to add something quickly on this before we move on to the next topic.
You did some of that to myself as well, Sarah. So
yeah.
just very briefly, I mean, I agree with a hell of a lot of what Michaela's just said there. We need to realise early doors that a planning consent and the uplift of land value will not, in every case, meet the requirements for a given community or a place. I touched on in my presentation a comment about negative land values. I mean, the development sector does what you call the residual value calculation. And despite probably a lot of myth that circulates house values, it's not really the new build sector that will set the market level for house values. By proportion, it is such a small proportion of overall house sales recorded in the country across the year. And most house values are done by a comparative valuation method by the RICS in any event. But coming to the question, I would take the approach first and foremost in terms of I call them Hondas, housing needs and demand assessment. I think the first question should be, do people want to live? And I think once we've established that, there is a piece around about, well, where does capacity exist in terms of infrastructure? It may well be that you've got a match between where people want to live and where there's capacity in existing infrastructure. You will then quickly find there will be a gap where infrastructure is needed and has to be paid for in some shape or form. At the moment, we've got a Section 75 system that does that. And I think at the end of that, there's going to be some kind of high-level spatial strategy to do around about the economics. And I don't think collaboration on that front has worked well in any shape or form over the last few decades. And I think it's been too much of I would call it an us and them type of approach, where we've had different sides of the coin, coming from different viewpoints as opposed to focusing on the solution.
Great. I'm conscious that I want to kind of move on, and we've got lots of questions in the chat appearing up. I don't know if any of the other panelists just want to add their halfpenny worth on that before we move on.
Yeah, if I could come in
Yes,
very briefly.
Peter, yeah.
I think we've got a reasonably good idea of need, but let's face it, need's fluid, it changes. You need to keep on top of that, but we don't have the ability to deliver it where it's most needed. And agree with everything that's been said, it's infrastructure that's often the key. And we have a system where we have different organisations working to different rules, ranging from Scottish Water, which is funded for growth for housing, but not for other aspects, to commercial organisations, which are not there to facilitate the aims and objectives of the national planning policy. And we need coordination there. We need all our infrastructures to be there facilitating growth, not being a barrier to growth. And I've said it time and time again, one of our major barriers is Transport Scotland. The other factor is, I don't think we will ever seek to recover the full value of investment in infrastructure, because we are usually looking at addressing severe underinvestment rather than just creating new capacity. So the whole provision around infrastructure needs clarity. Thank you.
Excellent. We've got a question. We've got lots of statements. Sorry, am I still on mute?
No, can hear you.
Sorry, that's fine. Sorry, I was trying to check in with the chat there. So we've got quite a lot of statements and comments in the chat there. But I wondered if any of you want to come in and ask a question. Stefano Smith, you'd popped something up in the chat. Do you want to come in with your question?
Hi, Sara. Thanks very much for that. Yes, I had two questions in the chat function. One in relation to infrastructure funding, and the other one in relation to delivery of affordable housing. I'll just raise the infrastructure funding question, which was specifically, I've been involved on a couple of pieces of research for Scottish Government supporting various organisations, firstly on the infrastructure charging mechanism, which has led to the infrastructure levy within the Flattening Scotland Act, which is a sunset clause. And the most recent piece is on specifically Section 75 and developer contributions and the value, impact and incidence of Section 75s. And my question was, how is this research shaping and influencing not only Scottish Government's development of policy, NPF4, for example, or secondary legislation on the Act, or thinking within the industry? I suppose the obvious question is, are you familiar with those pieces of research? Have you read it, or at least the recommendations, and how do you think they will influence the discussion on infrastructure delivery?
Barbara, can I come to you on that?
I was going to ask if you would actually. I don't know if people have been watching the news today, but the headline in Ireland is all about the national plan delivery and the resources needed to deliver that, how much it's going to cost to deliver the commitments that are in the national plan. Scotland needs to have the same approach. We're great at making great statements and putting things in plans and saying this needs to happen here or there or wherever. And I know we've focused a lot on what's volume and big things, and that doesn't address smaller rural communities and you know, things where an individual house plot could make a big difference to a community. But I'll stick with that anyway. We need to put a price on things, and that's different to the value of stuff. We need to say, how much is this going to cost? And where are we looking to for that cost? Is some of it coming from government? Are we expecting the private sector to make its contribution there? And if we can't afford it, what's it doing in the plan? I think we've just got to stop making promises we can't keep. Sorry, it's as simple as that.
No,
which is not simple at all, I realize.
No, not
because
simple
of course the debate now in Ireland is, well, have they identified enough money for things? And that will always be an argument as well. But it's a really good starting point to actually say, how much is it going to cost to deliver the plan that Scotland's going to set out? And I have to say as well, is the new NPF4 going to be headline news when it comes out in Scotland? I hope so. It's unlikely. It doesn't tend to happen. You know, we need to engage our population with these conversations as well. So as Michaela says, you're removing some of that conflict from it. This is a Team Scotland. We're a small place. We should be able to do this more collaboratively.
Yeah, and we need to work right across public, private and third sector to make these things happen. But as ever, I mean, I think I am really conscious of time, but so I'd really like to come to each of the panelists very briefly around, you know, Barbara makes an excellent point there around, we need to put a price on things and who pays. And actually, how do we relate that to the wider economy? Where are we going to put this housing? Are we putting it in the right place? We in the Infrastructure Commission, we kind of dodged this issue of the slow migration from west to east that's beginning to happen. Are we planning for that? Are we going to enable that and build more houses in the east and allow depopulation of the west? Or are we going to address it proactively and do something about it? You know, are we going to? So that was my. I mean, so if you've got a kind of, there's so much to do here, and we need to focus on delivery and joined up working. So, what's your kind of top recommendation as we're leaving this conversation around enabling this to happen? If you were God for the day, how do you make this happen?
I'd be happy to have a go first, Sara, and a way of thinking would follow on from Stefano's question about the report in section 75 and infrastructure. And I think what that showed is that the spec house building model works very well where there's the value, you know, delivers affordable housing. But interestingly, I think maybe 90% of the contributions maybe only came from a very small number of local authority areas. So really going back to my presentation, I think to deliver homes in other parts of Scotland so we get all of these benefits in terms of economy and place and better public health, we need to find a way where the public sector is better resourced. I think the land agency is a big part of that and can actually help to deliver where at the moment the private sector wouldn't, to essentially spread the benefits of new housing in place.
Great. Peter, what's your parting shot? You're on mute.
Sorry about that. Somebody was bound to do it soon. I entirely agree with Barbara about the needing to cost strategies, but the chances of actually aligning all our strategies in Scotland is remote when they're all done at different timescales. We've got far too many different strategies, so that's one issue. but we also need to look at the long-term benefits of developments. David, touched on it, look at the health benefits. Now,